Archaofuturism is a manifesto written by Guillame Faye, which describes a combination of traditionalism and futurism that will follow after the collapse of liberal states due to various catastrophes. Faye was formerly a member of the French Nouvelle Droite, or New Right, who you might know due to Front National's tenuous associations with that movement. Front National is the party of the now disgraced Marine Le Pen, who has been temporarily banned from running due to embezzlement. The Nouvelle Droite also had some influence on the European identitarian movement, the foremost group of which was Generation Identitaire, which held demonstrations against mass migration. I will speak a bit more on the Nouvelle Droite when I get to covering Alain de Benoist, who was the founder of the movement, who is currently the leader of the nationalist think tank Gresse. All in all, France has proven to have been, since the 1980s, a fruitful region in the production of novel right-wing thought. Faye left the Nouvelle Droite just before the 90s and engaged in a successful radio and television career until he returned to writing later in the 90s. In 1998, he published this book, Archeofuturism. Those familiar with the right-wing dialectic against mass migration and multiculturalism will find that many of Faye's arguments seem unoriginal or cliché, but we have to keep in mind that this book was published in 1998. In many ways, Faye was ahead of his time. He saw the contradiction between the general will of democracy and so-called diversity. He saw ethnomasochism and xenophilia characteristic of liberals and the left, and he was perhaps one of the first to call mass migration a form of colonialism. We will get to why he believes this towards the end. It's a pretty good argument, actually. He also saw that multiracial societies are multi-racist societies in the sense that migrants do not dissolve their tribal loyalties and identities when they come to our atomized liberal countries. Additionally, he saw the contradiction between those liberals who promote patriotism and their approval of multiracism, although I would argue that what these people do is perfectly compatible with patriotism. Our disagreement mostly comes down to a difference in perspective. The first chapter of this book is a post-mortem of sorts on the Nouvelle Droite. The movement still exists today, although its influence has dropped dramatically as no one except those obsessed one way or the other with Alexander Dugin mentions them. Faye laments the decline of praxis that the movement fell into, as they have become increasingly concerned with obscure questions about art that do not pertain to politics nor appeal to anyone relevant. He criticizes the movement's paganism, as paganism cannot possibly have influence on the Christian society. He argues that the third worldism of Alain de Benoist and his followers ignores the looming threat of Islam on the Western world, and Faye also observes that the movement fell into intellectual stagnation due to its lack of debate and its tendency to coalesce into a uniformity of thought. These reasons are why he left the Nouvelle Droite. Now let's get to the book proper. What is most of interest to us today is Faye's historical predictions, as well as his recommendations for structuring society. As I've said, Faye predicts that a convergence of catastrophes will end today's liberal states. These catastrophes are the consequences of the political principles of liberalism leading to the return of ethnic identities and tribal warfare, ecological catastrophe caused by pollution and climate change, as well as the mass exploitation of the world's resources, which will lead to global scarcity, global economic catastrophe caused by declining populations and growth, as well as an aging population that requires more and more healthcare, combined with the financial demands of an expanding welfare state, the rise of the global south, which will quickly become a geopolitical rival to the north, and eventually result in colonialism and warfare, and finally the global proliferation of nuclear weapons and mafias. Faye predicts that after the convergence of catastrophes, we will see a prompt atavism of archaic values, partly due to the collapse of liberal humanitarianism, and partly due to Nietzsche's concept of the eternal return of the same. These include tradition, magic and superstition, ethnic identity and tribalism, techne, which is Greek for practical knowledge, discipline, aesthetics, and inegalitarian hierarchy. Faye, drawing from Julius Evola, argues that the present state of world decline, which is the result of the liberal attitude, cannot be overcome through resistance nor reaction. Instead, he believes that history is cyclical and that we are much closer to the end of our age than we are to any kind of golden age. Therefore, the proper course of action is to engage in revolutionary action and envision a dynamic future rather than to simply conserve or return to the values of the past. Faye criticizes traditionalists for condemning or alternatively ignoring the Faustian attitude of modern man. He argues that we should instead find a way to combine tradition with futurist progress in the sense of a movement, not a liberal or Marxist historicism. He sums it up as, quote, "We must reconcile Evola with Marienetti." The product of this synthesis is Archaofuturism. The basis for this formulation is what he calls vitalistic constructivism. He defines his view as more or less postmodern, arguing that values are fundamentally created by people, and that the world must necessarily be viewed differently by different people. This is how he justifies combining two largely incompatible doctrines. By centering his view not in the absolute, but instead in man, something he calls an anthropophilic attitude, he can justify creating a sort of dualism and using these ideas as political tools rather than as principles in and of themselves. In Archaofuturism, those who pursue technological advancement and those who pursue tradition are divided into two separate kinds of societies: feudal agrarian states and technocratic industrial states. The reason for this is that the liberal dream of spreading technical industrial civilization to every region of the world is impossible due to the scarcity of resources and energy, something that Faye calls the liberal faith in miracles. In contrast, these technocratic states will centralize what resources are available in order to supercharge research. This will take place through a globalized market, and Faye presents a nuance on this question, which is that globalization is not the same as internationalization. He argues that a globalized market can exist without requiring intermixture of peoples, because globalism only pertains to a very small elite of people. The technocratic states are to be foundational on a kind of quote-unquote philosopher's agnosticism based on the will to power, which drives the desire for technical progress rather than a humanitarian desire to improve the conditions for all of humanity. Rather than liberal egalitarianism, Faye predicts a strict inegalitarianism based on technical means, such as genetic engineering, human hybridization, and artificial procreation. He believes that scientists will create human-animal hybrids to serve as slaves, acephalic bodies for the purpose of organ harvesting, and hypergenius scientists who will lead the quest for technology. The agrarian states, on the other hand, will be based on a sort of integral traditionalism based on the transmission of spiritual values. One might think that this societal dualism would collapse into wars based on resentment and envy, but Faye argues that the values imposed on both societies would self-justify their respective conditions. Traditionalist states would be content to live in relatively medieval conditions because a cyclical view of history creates placidity. In contrast, the will to power results in a historical view akin to what he calls Nietzsche's spherical view of history, which is the idea that history returns to the same, but according to dynamic movements. The metaphor he gives is a ball, which has a point etched onto it moving across a pool table. When the ball moves, the point continually returns to the same orientation, but the ball is in a different place. Much of this book is dedicated to critiquing certain aspects of modern society. Faye, like Evola, attacks sports on the grounds that they are a distraction from true values and issues. He extends this also to other games, like video games or virtual reality. But he diverges from common right-wing attacks on sports by arguing that sports does not cause multiracialism, and further that sports is not a sublimation of politics or identity onto a useless plane. He says that what sports produces isn't a multiracialism, but rather it produces a materialistic attitude characteristic of liberalism. People are measured according to their physical capabilities, such as distance sprinting or long jumping. He says that any horse could outperform a human at distance sprinting, and thus sports reduces humanity to animality. Faye also attacks television and cinema in the same vein as Guy Debord and his Society of the Spectacle. In short, he more or less thinks that mass media hypnotizes and renders unconscious the people who consume it, causing a sort of distraction from the real world and a paralysis of critical thought. Lastly, we might know Faye's criticisms of Christianity. He believes liberalism is a secularized Christianity, an idea that today Nathan Coffness and Keith Woods are an exponent of, so we can say that Faye was probably ahead of the curve unless someone else came up with this idea. It's probable that this idea maybe originated in the Nouvelle Droite itself due to its paganism. Faye argues that the liberal Christian humanitarianism serves as the greatest impediment to technological advancement, since its anthropocentrism tends to lead people to reject transhumanism or genetic engineering. In other words, Imago Dei is a real limit on the horizons of humanity. He also blames Christian universalism on the egalitarian trend of our day, which necessarily limits technical innovation, since innovation can only pertain to a small elite. That is more or less what the book consists of. One reactionary reviewer said that Faye's ideas are insane and believed that his predictions seem rather far-fetched. But on the contrary, I think that some of the predictions he makes are incontrovertible. Industrial society is exploiting the world, the climate is changing. We can debate whether economies will collapse due to internal reasons, but we do know that ethnic tensions are rising and that demographic replacement will pose a challenge to technically driven liberal states reliant on the competence and productivity of populations. We can question whether the global south will become a genuine geopolitical rival, but it is without doubt that this colonization which Faye speaks of is true. He argues that mass migration is not an invasion, but rather colonization because the south serves as something of a home base for migrants. It is really then just a question of what will happen after the catastrophe. If technological society cannot be expanded to the globe, then it must be localized. That is a rational thing to predict. If only some states can be technical, then other states must be primitive. That rationally follows. If ethnic tensions are rising, then states will have to coalesce around ethnicities. That makes sense. If modern man has basically a Faustian attitude, then we will expect technical advancement to continue in a more or less amoral way. That makes sense. I fail to see what is wrong or insane about these predictions. Now I will give my opinion on the book's ideas. It should go without saying that traditionalism and futurism are on principle opposed to each other. It's only by denying the epistemic basis of one or the other that we can mesh them together, and not without compromise. Much of what Faye blames on Christianity is also true of integral tradition as a whole. The divine centrality of man is actually a classical doctrine, and so we could call it pagan. We can see it in Plato's writings, including the Timaeus and First Alcibiades, where man is considered to be divine perfection. We can even see in Plato's conception of the original state of man that man was a sphere, and the sphere is the symbol of perfection. Man, therefore, has a theomorphic quality, and to change the form of man is to commit sacrilege. Modifying the Christian attitude is not sufficient to enable unrestrained technical advancement, which is probably why Faye ultimately decides that he must part with traditional values and promote a kind of atheism for technical society. When Faye speaks of turning technical research into a quote-unquote esoteric alchemy, he is only saying so metaphorically. He simply means confining technical knowledge to a small and secretive elite, but nonetheless, he calls it initiatory, which is simply an abuse of that term. If we are to accept integral traditionalism, then we have to accept its metaphysics and its epistemology. Faye's divagation into postmodernism via his vitalistic constructivism is simply an abrogation of the principles of tradition. Faye is not reconciling Evola and Marienetti. He is eviscerating Evola with Marienetti. Now we have to consider his historical predictions. Regardless of what I think about his recommendations for society, history is just a question of what will happen. If you ask me what's most likely, I don't think that immigration will be so catastrophic that it'll collapse the liberal system very soon. Liberal states will probably shut off the tap because once it becomes clear that immigration no longer enhances economic conditions, they'll have to reckon with this problem. And by 50 years, it'll become undeniable that immigration has terrible social costs. Even today, Keir Starmer says that the UK is quote-unquote a nation of foreigners. It's unthinkable for a liberal politician to acknowledge that. I feel confident that eventually the mainstream will turn against immigration, and to some extent against cultural pluralities. It will also, once the condition intensifies, turn to remigration. This won't be because it is making overtures to the right, nor because the right has any real influence. It will instead be because liberals suddenly become concerned about the stability of the system. If it degenerates into ethnic conflicts, it won't last for long, and if those ethnic conflicts break out, it will force the hand of the state. What Faye is doing is the same error that James Burnham made in The Managerial Society, which is to identify a tendency that exists and then catastrophize it. The implicit basis for this is that people don't decide to change their behavior, so the tendency will continue until it reaches its natural conclusion. But we know that people do react to situations and consequences, so there's no reason to think that mass migration will continue to the 0 point. If demographic catastrophe won't destroy liberalism, then what will? I predict that the most important and deadly catastrophe that exists, one of which Faye points out, is resource scarcity. There's probably about 200 to 300 years of resources left to easily exploit in civilized areas, and by the time these deposits are depleted, then there will be a mad dash toward the last remaining territories. Western Asia/Eastern Russia, as well as Africa, are relatively unexploited as of right now. We will see at this point a return of colonialism and imperialist expansion, which will cause warfare between competing superpowers. China is ahead of the curve and is making inroads to Eastern Africa. The West will cease its geopolitical complacency and begin competing to colonize Western Africa. We might expect this to happen sooner rather than later as a response to Chinese influence. Neocolonialism will cause a period of warfare that will last probably around 300 years, after which point the world's resources have been almost completely drained. This would cause the breakdown of developed states and cause balkanization rather than the creation of supranational unities. With the breakdown of economic relations, nations will have nothing that binds them together, and furthermore, an atavism of tribalism would result in particularistic ethnic identifications, not pan-whiteism. In antiquity, the conception of race was much more variegated than today, so much so that we could have spoken of a Hellenic race, or even more narrowly, an Athenian race, and so on. If what Faye says is true, and that we will see the return of archaic values, then it must necessarily turn out that way. Thus, the world will break down into the globalized dualism that Faye and the World Economic Forum projects, a division between agrarian feudalism and developed technocracies. These technocracies will have sufficient sustainable technology to provide a limited form of energy, which will be rationed by the state, to drive a more or less futuristic and managerial society without property rights. The agrarian nations will be deeply impoverished and populated only by small, miserable groups subject to regular famines due to poor environmental conditions. There will probably be a lot of conflict between the technological and agrarian states, and possibly even wars of acquisition between feudal and technocratic ones, which is a point on which I differ from Faye. This will be more or less the condition of the world for the rest of history, unless it becomes possible to colonize other planets or to mine asteroids. As Faye says, the fantasy that we can spread societies dependent on high energy usage to the entire world is a fantasy. Futurist society can only take place in very limited areas and among limited numbers of people. By no means am I proposing a literal end to history a la Fukuyama. There will still be wars, there might be imperialism when feudal states conquer each other, and we could see the rise of something that resembles Caesar's Legion, which might pose a serious threat to the technocratic societies despite their advanced technology. They could not withstand the might of greater sections of the world. The notion that the global south will be anything other than a region of backwards and semi-functional states is absurd. That's the entire reason why people are leaving them in the first place. We have to be realistic about the conditions of these people. To believe in an egalitarianism, but predict the liberal idea of world socio-development will bear fruits is absurd. Of course, we also have to consider the phenomenon of brain drain. Archaofuturism is perhaps one of the most unique world pictures I've seen thus far. Faye is correct when he says that he is producing audio shocks. In our world of AI and the coming fourth industrial revolution, proposing cyborgs, clones, and hybrids cannot but result in a certain fever. Taking the vision of the world exposited by the WEF in their Vision 2030, you will own nothing and be happy, then proposing this as a right-wing idea is certainly shocking. The idea that globalization can contribute to an inegalitarianism is also bound to be rather unpopular as an insight. On principle, I must reject the proposals that Faye makes as a traditionalist, but I have to admit that his predictions have at least a fair chance of being true.